No, it's just what we say to each other. That's the Serene's party thing coming to me. Like, I can't even hear this. Right. Okay, Jerry.
Check.
Right there? Okay.
She'll be right there. But you'll see her right there. This way.
So I should talk that way to Emily?
That way they'll look like they're talking to her, but she'll actually be
Oh,
there.
They said they were walking here around the corner. Good evening, everyone. So we started, my name is Rita Walters. I'm the Vice President for Development and Alumni Relations here at Union. We started to make a very gentle applause when Dean Kelly Brown Douglas came to the stage. Can we just do it again? Bravo. We are so thrilled to be here, and I say Kelly because we have such a great kinship and friendship. So if out of just such respect, I'm only going to refer to you as Dean Douglas this evening. But Dean Douglas, we are so proud of you and so happy. This book is a long time coming, but it has arrived just on time. So thank you again. So welcome, everyone. We are excited that you're here. Today we welcome you to Union at Home and EDS at Union's book launch for our very own Dean Kelly Brown Douglas's new book, Resurrection Hope, A Future Where Black Lives Matter. And here's a cover of the book for our audience at home. The Union at Home Festival is a series of events each fall that safely brings our Union family together to celebrate what makes this community special. Programming includes opportunities to connect with anniversary classes and affinity groups, learn more about our student union's experiences, and participate in various community-wide virtual activities and events. But before we get started, a couple little housekeeping things. For our live audience, the bathrooms are in the back, so if you go straight through the door, the bathroom will be on your right-hand side. Also, for our online viewers, you may begin posting questions as fast as you have them, and please use the chat to do so. And for those who are joining us live, we have a new methodology if we didn't want to pass a mic around. But if you and take out your phones now, this is the time you can take out your phones. If you text to 646, and the number is here, and I'll repeat it a couple of times throughout the evening, but the number is 646-397-6144, and I'll say it again slowly. The number is 646-397-6144. And you could text any and all of your questions to that phone number. And this evening, we're going to have time for the Q&A, and those questions will be there. Oh wow, I'm so excited that Dean Kelly Brown Douglas, her family has arrived here, and you missed the wondrous applause that we gave her already, right? But you will have your chance, because it's going to happen throughout the evening, because we are just so thrilled. But she is so proud and so delighted and elated that all of you are here. But there's so our board members, our previous colleagues, there are so many of you who joined us here this evening, but especially a welcome to her beloved husband, Desmond, who's here. Desmond is her son, who's here in the audience. Lamont, her husband, who is here. And her very best friend, who I learned this earlier, who was at her wedding. So again, her sister friend is here, and her name is Rebecca. But she told me your name was Ethel earlier. So, Renee, right, Renee. Renee, right. So we are thrilled that you all are here and that all of you are here. Without any further ado, we'd like to get our program started. I'm going to introduce our president, Dr. Serene Jones, a highly respected scholar and public intellectual. The Reverend Dr. Serene Jones is the 16th president of the historic Union Theological Seminary here in the city of New York. She's the first woman to head this 185-year-old institution, and she occupies the Johnson Family Chair for Religion and Democracy. She is the author of several books herself, including Trauma and Grace, and most recently her memoir, Call It Grace, Finding Meaning in a Fractured World. Without any further ado, I present to you Dr. Serene Jones.
Thank you, Rita, for that introduction, and thank you to everyone who put their really loving, heartfelt energy into the making of this evening possible. Feels like here in James Chapel, we have family together, and it's a very blessed thing, and particularly having Lamont, Desmond, and Renee here is very special, so thank you for coming. And as you'll note, the book is dedicated to Lamont, so it's a wonderful thing. So I am honored to be celebrating the publication of Resurrection Hope, A Future Where Black Lives Matter. It was published by Orbis this November 17th, so it is literally hot off the press. And as you all know, it is authored by the brilliant, wise, prophetic theologian and dear friend, the Reverend Dean Kelly Brown Douglas. And I'm also excited that with us today to respond to and discuss and celebrate this book are other luminary scholars in the world of theological education, Dean Emily Towns, the Dean of Vanderbilt Divinity School, who is with us on the screen. Emily, welcome and thank you for coming. The Reverend Dr. Timothy Atkins Jones, who is here at the end, who is a professor of homiletics here at Union. And Dr. Gary Dorian, who is also up here in the middle. So, Gary, thank you. So I'm going to just do a quick introduction in a little more detail of our panelists and of our person of honor, and then we're going to have a reading from the beginning of the book by Dean Douglas, and then we will get to the conversation. So, Emily Towns is a distinguished scholar and leader in theological education. She is the first African American woman elected to the presidential line of the American Academy of Religion, which she led in 2008. She was inducted as a fellow in the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2009. She has served as the president of the Society for the Study of Black Religion from 2012 to 2016. She has broad areas of expertise, including Christian ethics, cultural theory and studies, postmodernism and social postmodernism. She has a strong interest in thinking critically about womanist perspectives on issues such as healthcare, economic justice, poetry, and literary theory, about which she has written voluminously. And she is a very good friend to both Dean Douglas and myself for many years. And we're very proud that on her list of many accomplishments is her faculty appointment at Union Theological Seminary, a time that is remembered with great fondness by all of her colleagues. So Emily, welcome. And I should say, this is the first time that we have done a Zoom screen to actually try to represent a panelist sitting next to these panelists. So we tried to get the size about right, so you just think of her as another one of the five up here. I'm also pleased to say a little more about Reverend Dr. Timothy Atkins Jones. He is senior pastor of the historic Bethany Baptist Church in Newark, New Jersey, and he's assistant professor of homiletics at Union. As the son of the Black church, he is deeply invested in its flourishing and in sharing the wisdom from this great faith tradition to those unfamiliar, particularly the wisdom and brilliance of Black preaching. As he says of his own vocation, my call often takes me outside of the academy and the church to organize for a variety of issues in my community. In this regard, he is an activist and a powerful intellectual and community leader, which makes him perfect for a conversation about this amazing book. And then we have Dr. Gary Dorian, who is with us, who just 3 weeks ago we celebrated his publication of American Democratic Socialism. He teaches social ethics, theology, and philosophy of religion as the Reinhold Niebuhr Professor of Social Ethics here at Union, and is Professor of Religion at Columbia University. He was previously the Parfait Distinguished Professor at Kalamazoo College, where he taught for 18 years and served as the Dean of the Stetson Chapel and Director of the Liberal Arts Colloquium. He has authored over 20 books and more than 300 articles. It would be like this tall if we were to stack it up. And it ranges across the fields of social ethics, philosophy, history, theology, political economy, political theory, religious history, cultural criticism, intellectual history. And I recommend American Democratic Socialism to all of you as a must-read for those who are interested in the history of the political left in the U.S. So Gary, thank you for being here. And then last but very much not least, I am very honored to introduce the very Reverend Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas, who was named Dean of the Episcopal Divinity School at Union Theological Seminary in September of 2017, a glorious day for this institution. She also holds the prestigious Bill and Judith Moyers Chair in Theology, a chair formerly held by her mentor and friend, Dr. James Cone. She also serves as the canon theologian at the Washington National Cathedral and the theologian in residence at Trinity Church Wall Street. She is widely published in national and international journals and many publications. Her groundbreaking and widely taught book, Sexuality in the Black Church, A Womanist Perspective, from 1999, was the first to address the issue of homophobia within the Black church community. Her book, Stand Your Ground, Black Bodies and the Justice of God, published in 2015, examines the challenges of a stand your ground culture for the Black church and for Black life in the U.S. Her other books include The Black Christ, 1994, and its 25th anniversary edition just in 2019. It's a book that I taught often in teaching systematic theology. She's also written What's Faith Got to Do with It? Black Bodies / Christian Souls, 2005. And Black Bodies and the Black Church, A Blues Slant, in 2012, which seeks to move the Black church beyond its oppressive views towards LGBTQ bodies and sexuality in general. In addition, Dean Douglas is also the co-editor of Sexuality and the Sacred, Sources for Theological Reflection, and I'm very happy to tell you that she now hosts a regular podcast, Facebook Live series that has gained national attention and a wide audience. entitled Just Conversations. Please find it on your YouTube channel if you haven't yet discovered the treasures of the interviews she holds with leading activists and thinkers across the nation. She is a world-renowned scholar and public intellectual whose work spans decades. I'm not talking about your age yet, but whose work spans decades and whose insights, critiques, and vision have literally transformed the landscape of public theology and Black theology in the U.S. She is not just a continually rising star, which she is also risen and shines her light brightly and brings both bold critique and sustaining hope into all corners of American culture and politics. And in all of her writing, pushes us closer towards a future where Black lives matter. I have the great honor of working closely with Kelly on a day-to-day basis and know her to be a person of deep faith and profound wisdom, as well as an activist of unwavering energy and a pastor with a huge heart. And for those of you who have read the book, you'll get this. And she has a wonderful laugh. A theme which is important in this book as we discuss it tonight. In all ways, she embodies the resurrection hope she points us to. So excited about this and so much to talk about. But I'm going to open us up now to the conversation by asking Kelly, at my request, to please come forward and read to us the opening of the book, which has a starring role for a young man sitting on the front row of our gathering, and then we'll turn to the conversation.
Thank you, Serene, and thank you all for being here. I am humbled, so humbled by it. And for all of you who have joined me in this conversation. One of the wonderful things about my coming back to Union after some decades ago, when I was a student here, is that I get to come back and be with colleagues who are my friends. And I count them as my friends, and to work with someone who has been a longtime friend, which is Serene. And of course, I thank Dr. Towns. She and I do a lot of womanish chatting together, and my friend, and they each expand my imagination of what is possible, and that's a gift. And so Serene, when she tells me to do something, I don't say no. And so she told me, "You're reading from your book?" And so I said, "Oh, okay." But thank you. And I must say before I go on that you write a book in isolation, but you only get to do that because you have those who support you along the way. Otherwise, it doesn't happen. And there were many people, and many of you were here, who supported me along the way and made this book possible. I've got to recognize my colleague, that is my dear friend now on this journey, and who carried things forward and gave me the space to write, Miguel Escobar. Yes. Thank you doesn't cover it, but this book came into fruition because of what you do. And I must also thank someone who came in from Atlanta, not for this, but she stayed in for this, that from beginning to end encouraged me, and when I was down, said, you can do it, and do it, and helped in so many ways. Robin Reese, who you all know. I'll just name a couple more people and then I'll read. And of course, there is the indomitable Douglas Berger. Need I say more? Thank you, Douglas, for unmeasured support. My husband, without which none of this is possible, my partner in life, and just is there as the steady beat and the steady drum that never doubts, and I thank him. And of course, my best friend who traveled to, I said knew me before they knew me, before Desmond and Lamont, and thank you for taking the time to always support me and to come here. But I've got to end with Desmond, my son, who said, I told him I was keeping his text, and that I kept learning. Every time we text, I would go, oh my gosh, and kept learning from him. And so I asked his permission. He didn't believe me, and he said in another conversation, I didn't believe her when she said that she was keeping my text. I didn't think I was saying anything worthy. It was more than worthy. It's inspiring, it's sacred, it expanded possibilities for me and gave me hope. Without Desmond, this book just simply would never have happened. Thank you, my son. His Aunt Renee's trying to get him to stand. He's not going to do that. So let me read. Anselm's dictum that theology is faith seeking understanding perfectly describes my theological journey. Even before I knew the word theology, I struggled to understand the meaning of my faith in relationship to my blackness. That struggle has been reflected in my previous writings, from The Black Christ, 1994, to Stand Your Ground, Black Bodies and the Justice of God, 2015. At that point, my faith journey had taken me from understanding the meaning of Jesus' birth in a manger to his death on a cross. On that journey, I was affirmed in my faith that Jesus was black and therefore intimately identified with the black fight for life and wholeness in this country, a fight defined by the perverse realities of white supremacy, a fight of white supremacy. In discovering the blackness of Christ, I was able to affirm my love for Jesus without contradiction, because in fact, Jesus was black like me. Nevertheless, my struggle to affirm my faith in light of my blackness continues for me today, though perhaps in a more focused and intense way. For while I had initially wondered about the propriety of faith in what I originally believed to be a white Jesus, I now found myself struggling with the efficacy of faith itself. James Baldwin once said that there comes a time in the life of every black person in America when they must face the shock of discovering, as he said, the flag to which you have pledged allegiance has not pledged allegiance to you. And now, as the mother of a 6-foot-tall, lock-wearing 27-year-old black man, fearing for his life in this nation as much as I did when he was born, and realizing the gravity of this country's sin that is a mortal threat to all black life, I find myself facing the shock that perhaps the God of Jesus Christ, in whom black people have pledged our faith, has not really pledged allegiance to us. That shock was made even more real by the questions my son asked me. As Black death was becoming more and more routine in the nation, whether at the hands of police or from the COVID-19 virus, my son challenged my faith in a Black Christ. How do we really know that God cares when Black people are still getting killed? How long do we have to wait for the justice of God, he asked. I get it that Christ is Black, but that doesn't seem to be helping us right now. These are the questions that I seek to answer. This book reflects my journey of faith-seeking understanding amidst the cries of Black Lives Matter and the questions my son was asking me. Through this book, I attempt to answer these questions by first discerning why this nation is one that lets Black people die, and then figuring out what God has to say about it. This book is essentially a journey of faith. Thank you.
So this evening we're going to have a discussion that is a conversation amongst the four of us and our author. So I'm going to start off by asking our panelists, beginning with Dean Towns. I want to give you a chance to say what you would like to say about the book, but maybe anchor it in response to the question, as you read this, knowing Kelly's work so well, from its beginnings to now, what surprised or challenged you most about where this book begins and lands?
I'm not sure that surprised is the right word for my reaction. I think a better word for me, at least, would be what heartened me about the book. And that, for me, was not taking hope into a facile direction. It is very easy, I think, because hope is a category I use a lot, believe a lot. One of my favorite stories about hope involves Jim Cone telling me I had to maintain my hope. But it's also very easy to make it romantic and easy, and of course you can do it. And that's not what Kelly does in this book. It becomes, for me, an ongoing exercise of wrestling with the ways in which Black humanity is denied on a systematic basis, and we are not supposed to notice because it's normal, it's natural, it's the nature of things. But there's something wrong with that. There's something profoundly wrong with that, because we spend so much energy in this country as a nation, and I would argue probably globally, trying to make Black folk be what we are not. And what we are not is let me put it in the positive. What we are is human. And the fact that since day one, I would argue, when first loaded up on ships and brought to this country without our permission or desire, Black folk have been saying our lives matter. We are human. How can you do this? How can progress look like the hold of a slave ship? So as I was reading Kelly's book, and I actually sat down this morning at about 5 a.m. and read all my underlinings all over again. Took about 2 or 3 hours. I found over and over again, this book makes me wrestle. That doesn't surprise me about Kelly and her work. But this book also made me wonder, what in the hell is wrong with us that we would do this to each other? So it wasn't a surprise. I expect that from Kelly. But what it did was make me, in a semester, which I'm sure all of us have had who are teaching, it's been exhausting, ready to have it over. I actually was energized this morning when I finished, because I basically finished the book and went, oh, hell no. And got up and walked into a meeting with the provost and smiled.
So Tim, how would you describe what you found most heartening in your reading of this amazing book?
Well, many a sermon has attempted to save itself by talking about he died all day Friday, he was dead all day Saturday, and early Sunday morning got up with all power in his hand, and going to the resurrection is a rhetorical move often. But oftentimes, once you get there, there's still on the other end a so what. So what was heartening to me in this work is that not only are we not stuck at the cross, but we're also not stuck at the tomb. And the point beyond that, to what does the resurrection mean in a very real way? I think I was also heartened by just the accessibility of a book that can not only frame itself around textual conversations between mother and son, talk about amnesis, quote everyone from, I don't know, Michelle Alexander to Patrice Cullors, and just go all across the map. It's very accessible. And so much like I've done before, we used sexuality in the Black church in my church. I will very readily be able to use Resurrection Hope both in the classroom and in the church. And so I think it takes great, amazing skill to be able to write in such a way that has such academic depth, but also is accessible to the lay, the clergy, to academics alike. So I'm heartened by its utility. I'm heartened that this great research is able to be shared amongst so many that need it. And lastly, I'll say that I think that there was a word for everybody, that it takes, in my own religious tradition, I'm not in a situation where I'm having a lot of conversations, at least within the church house, with white folk. That doesn't happen a lot in the Black Baptist tradition unless I'm going outside of the church house. That's not Dean Douglas's story for the sake of her faith tradition. And because of that, there is a word here for good white folk, there's a word here for Black folk, there's a word for everybody. And I think it takes a lot of not only wisdom, but again, courage to be able to give flat-footed that kind of critique, particularly when you're not talking about only the kinds of folk that would be behind the January 6th insurrection, but you're talking about folk who know to say Black Lives Matter, who know exactly where to be, where to stand, where to march, and yet the ways that the white gaze is so all-encompassing. And I think Dean Douglas does, again, just an excellent job of naming that, but then also not just naming it, giving steps for, well, here's what we can do to move and to push past it. So I was heartened because there is a way forward, and I too feel like I can run on and see what the end's going to be.
Gary. I was just thinking about what Tim said. Gary, so what did you find most heartening or challenging about this book?
Well, firstly, the book is beautiful and searing and important. But that's true of all of Kelly's books. You know. Yeah, surprising wouldn't have registered for me either. That's partly a function of the fact that, we talked about it while you were writing it, so I kind of knew what was coming. We were also, during that whole time, also in a conversation about the whole course of your work, right? So I am, if anything, too prone to sort of look for that kind of thing, to even have a kind of subtext rolling as I'm reading a new book to see how a similar figure or similar argument, similar use of scripture is happening again, or now is being used in a different way, or the like. And this book is just chock full of that sort of consideration for me. I'm just so sort of conscious of just how you began your career, the way Serene mentioned. With the Black Christ in 1994. So for so many of us, that just immediately became an essential part of our canon. You just don't teach certain subjects without using it. And so there are things even in that book that I see on later readings of it, because there are things in that book that aren't the central matter, but which then prefigure themes that you bring out later on. And so then there are all these sort of points of connection in a work that I think does have a continuity of perception, does have certain things that are just always there. Kelly is always a womanist who's living on the questions and willing to put her existential just being on the line and ask personal questions and make herself vulnerable and ask just the riskiest kind of thing she could in that moment in the subject. I've just described her whole work, right? That's all the books are like. They're all like that. And one reason I'm starting this way is just that I know Kelly is prone, because she lives so much in the moment and speaks to what's going on right now, she's prone to emphasize what's different in it. And of course now we're in this most searing moment of all, of all these books that she's written. And so that by itself puts it on a somewhat different plane. I am, so far as that theme sort of goes, when she wrote, What's Faith Got to Do with It? She said, when I started this book, I wasn't sure I was going to be a Christian by the time I finished it. Right? She wrote the book to find out. And that's also the first time she does the kind of historical excavation, a kind of genealogy, that then becomes a trope for her, right? Because then she also did a similar thing with Stand Your Ground. And here again, it's the same kind of thing, a book in which she's leading with saying, I'm just not sure how I can even be a Christian in the moment. Now Trayvon Martin is cut down and all things like this by people you don't know, the same damn thing has happened, and how do I even be a Christian, and how do we protect black children in a context like this? And again, that book, one way of reading it, which I think she invites, is just to say how she even got to an answer. By the time you get to that stuff about a high holy God and just what hope you have for some kind of racial justice activism, it's a relief because it's so, it's searing what you're living in and through. And then, of course, this book is all those things, but now just cranked up because of what we're now in. A similar kind of historical excavation, a kind of genealogy of anti-blackness, paired with the question about, yes, how do I sustain any kind of hope? How is it that I am even some kind of Christian? And much less witness to it, testify to it to my son, who's asking me all these questions that sort of drive this book. I've certainly said enough to end right there, right? But I think I'm actually going to say something that is, that will speak to that challenge business. Because I did realize something reading this book, that that she puts out that she's going to be surprised that this is what I'm going to go for. But one of the things that is a little different in this book, despite what the impression that could be had from the reading we just had, there's actually less James Baldwin in this book than in several of Kelly's books. There are books of hers that run long, that need and have a great deal of James Baldwin, who's just speaking and breathing through it all the time and mobilizing major arguments, and you're coming back to them and so on. Much less of that in this book, right? It starts that way, but much less in the course of the text. And there even comes a moment when she says, I just can't live in there. I can't live there. That powerlessness, no. She said, what do you say? I'm an Episcopal priest, right? I'm a mother of a son. I can't just sit there, right? But then you go to something that is what stopped me cold, right? Because I realized something about myself. I believe in God's promise of a just future. Right? Pretty simple sentence. It stopped me cold because I realized I've never believed in that for a moment. Not for a moment. What we're called to, the work, living out of love, faith, struggle, hope, yes. Realize what you can. Certain kind of obligation that's on my heart, yes. I know all that, but I was an organizer for years before I even joined a church, and then before I was an academic. And in that kind of work I'd been doing before, I don't know any of us actually believed that there was some kind of just future out there, and at the end of what we're doing or what anybody was doing. It really was just this kind of trying to see how much of it we could get. And it stopped me cold to realize, wow, that question, that faith that you have of saying it that way and needing to say it and having that be the question is in fact in all these books, right? It's always there. And it is the difference that would probably, that it's wherever I don't go in the same direction with you or need to mobilize the argument in some way, it's undoubtedly this right here. That, yes, I've never believed it.
That is surprising. But thank you.
So maybe we needed a American social history of hope here. Next book. So I'm going to give an answer to the question I've asked by first saying what surprised me most, and second, what was most challenging and I think extremely important about this book. First of all, I am surprised that this book got written. Because I was texting and on the phone with Kelly as she was writing it. She said goodbye and left Union when winter break started. In the midst of COVID, she says, I'm going home to write a book. She had about a month. And I thought, you can't write a book in a month. And every time I texted or called, be it 6 o'clock in the morning, midnight at night, she was working on the book. And she had done the research for years preceding this book, but the intensity of the writing process, particularly given what was going on around her at the time. It wasn't as if she was writing this book in a quiet moment in history when you can sort of step back and reflect on, what has transpired. And I know, Lamont and Desmond, I'm not telling you anything you don't know about how hard she worked on this book. I think you probably had to pull her out of her office at times just to get some sleep. But as she was writing this book, I remember texting as the Capitol riot began, as she was writing, and she continued to write. And I remember so distinctly Kelly calling and saying, God, you know, I'm a germaphobe, I don't want to go out in COVID, but I am going down to the Capitol Square because Black Lives Matters is marching now, and I need to be there. And calling me from there, and just the experience of seeing the movement in all of its vast breadth and intensity and joy, and your laughter, and the laughter of resurrection. So it's not surprising knowing you that you did this, but it is, I think, a testament to what is so surprising about you, is the intensity of focus and the drivenness that you express throughout the book, but the feeling this has to be written, and I'm going to write it. What I found most challenging and most, I think, pertinent to the work that I do on a day-to-day basis in the church world of the United States is the brilliant section that she does on good white Christians, which are those progressive white Christians, the good liberals who think they understand all of the things that she's talking about, but in the midst of assuming they understand it all, often miss the most powerful truths that are guiding the Black Lives Matter movement. And they fail to see the deepest horrors of the theological imaginary of white supremacy. She lays out paradoxes for us in just this brilliant, agile way that is both theologically astute and as a series of social critiques just dead on. She talks about how in the white church for progressives, they want to talk about forgiveness and move very quickly to discussions of forgiveness. And they get pulled up short by having to confront black rage. And they cannot manage to see how forgiveness, which in the theology Kelly articulates as a forgiveness that transcends the mess of our given space, and is a forgiveness that comes from God, that says a loud no to the injustice and yet gives a future to black lives. It's a massive forgiveness. It's not just okay, now let's forget about this and move on. And it's a forgiveness that demands and calls out for the rage that gives witness to the horror of the history that we live in the midst of. And the second one, the tension between nonviolence and violence, and how often people say, well, I'm a nonviolent white Christian. People hardly ever say I'm a nonviolent white Christian. They'll say I'm a nonviolent Christian, and all this violence, this perceived violence, is just, makes me a little nervous. And she just goes straight for it and says, the violence of anti-blackness and white supremacy is what needs to be confronted head on. So you can't talk about nonviolence without talking about violence if you're going to talk about Black Lives Matter and the future. And then finally, the best one is peace. And she says, good white Christians love to talk about peace, but they really want to go from peace to unity. And isn't peace meaning that we all just get unified and hug each other and we're happy because we recognize we're all really the same, and they're terrified of division or of divisiveness. And Kelly just lays it out there and says, we are divided. We are divided. White supremacy and anti-blackness divides us. And until that is no more in this just future that Kelly imagines, we need to face into that division and call it what it is, and when it's necessary, hold it up as righteous, because it is what it takes to recognize where we need to go. So I found that section, just for my own work with white churches, just invaluable. And then there's I have to ask you, the pronunciation of the word. There's the section on anamnesis. Okay, how do you say it?
And see, she just set me up because I can write it, but I can't pronounce it. And I know some folks sitting out there that can pronounce it in purple and everywhere, and I'm looking at Gary, but I say anamnesis. Is that right, Gary?
Well, that's how I've heard it too, but...
Yeah, good, see, so, anamnesis.
Anamnesis, so yes. So I'm not going to say anything about anamnesis, but we'll come back to that in a moment. But Kelly, I want to ask you now this question, and because I have a sense of the process, but this book was a journey for you, and what was surprising to you and challenging to you as you embarked on the journey of writing this book?
First, the book that I wrote it was surprising to me as it was to you because, and Gary knows as well, he and I did talk and I told through this, and I remember before the Christmas holidays, Gary and I talked, and it's just the value of such a wonderful colleague and friend, and talked through things theologically and our faith journeys. And I said to Gary, I'm gonna squirrel away during January. Remember, Gary? And I'm gonna try to write this book during January, which meant when Miguel and Robin would call, I said I might as well have pitched a tent in my office because that's where I was, and I slept, and so as Lamont and Desmond know, and so I'm looking forward to enjoying this Christmas for more than 2 hours. But books call me, and that's the truth. And so it's nothing that I was itching to write, but something that I had to write. And not simply as a theologian, but as a mother, because I truly was trying to not simply answer my son's questions that he kept pushing me on, from Philandro Castile, and Desmond would sometimes text me or call me and say, his opening words, right, Desmond? Well, did you see the news? Right? And I knew, here we go. And I remember, for instance, when I always tried to, he would say to me, and he still does, I can never imagine a reason why I would ever call the police. And I used to try to convince him that there may be a time when you need to call the police. And nope, can't imagine it. Then, of course, Philandro Castile happened, and Desmond said, told you? Jacob Blake happened. Told you? And then I remember he texted or called, I can't remember which, and said, well, did you hear? I was like, what? And remember you said, so it seems like the guys are gonna get arrested for shooting into an apartment. But I guess, and nothing's gonna happen to them for killing Breonna Taylor. I said, I guess black lives don't matter. Told you, can never imagine ever calling the police. And by that time, I didn't argue with him anymore. And it was deep. These conversations went over a couple of years or so. And so I started trying to wrestle with these questions, and I realized that I wasn't talking abstractly about trying to create a future where Black Lives Matter, but trying to create a future where my son would be safe. And so there was this urgency that I didn't expect to really have to. I was writing myself through to the answers. And Gary, I say all the time, and I would say all the time, that I believe in a just future that God promises us. But as I wrote through this One of the reasons I was writing this book was to try to still believe in it, right? And to still try to believe in the justice of God. And I didn't know. That's the scary part. It's sort of like when you talk about stand your ground. When I got to the end of the first part of stand your ground, I thought I had written myself into a corner of no faith. And that was very scary to me. I thought, oh, well, this is it. And I did. And you and I've talked about this before. And with this book, I really did. I was holding on. Even in that section you read, I was trying to hold on to that. And so writing myself back into trying to hold on to it. And it was the Black Lives Matter protests that going down there that ultimately helped me to hold on to it. And so what surprised me about the book was the end, because I didn't know that I would get to that end, and I really mean that. And the beginning, that I wrote the book.
So let's go back and continue the discussion. I'll just ask one more question and we'll go around, and then I just want to open it up to the panelists to have a discussion between us. But Emily, we'll start with you again. And the question is, it's a simple one. The book just came out, so not everyone here has had a chance to read it yet. So if you had a particular moment in the book, I know Gary's already identified his, but a particular moment that was piercingly important or jumped off the page at you, what would be that moment or moments that you would lift up? Emily?
It was the afterword. I was in tears. I was hoping that's what Kelly would read tonight, but that kind of reaffirmation of faith in the midst of some fairly challenging questions from Desmond, whom I've never met, but I feel like I know him because Kelly talks about him all the time. But that afterword, or this afterword, really, if she wrote nothing else in the book and just put the afterword and put it between two bookends, that would be it.
Tim?
As someone from Richmond, Virginia, the capital of Confederacy, and someone who had to deal with Confederate symbols for the entirety of my life, so much so that I don't even remember it registering as something that should register for a long time. And I'll never forget my senior year of high school, I believe it was, we had the audacity as a city to put a statue of Arthur Ashe on Monument Avenue, which is an avenue that was full surrounding putting a statue of someone who is a hero of the city. I mean, Arthur Ashe was a legend in Richmond and in the world, certainly. And so that was really my first introduction to the power of symbols and what they can mean and why some need to be eradicated because of what they hold on to and what they represent. And so I think that the way that Dean Douglas addressed more, I believe it's more than symbols, in the way that she discusses how, what symbols mean, how they need to be taken down, what they are communicating. Again, as someone coming from my contacts with my history, that resonated quite deeply. And so I kept going back to that and just reliving those days, and juxtaposed with, there's a picture we have in my house with my family standing in front of the Robert E. Lee monument now with the graffiti over it. And my wife, my kids, we have our fist up in front of it from last summer. And so those juxtaposed images in my head wrestling, and now with the kind of theological understanding to work through what all of that means. That meant a lot to me.
Well, I've already addressed the question, so I guess I get to just freelance for a moment. And I think I'm going to do that by just actually underscoring something that Serene said. She talked about just what a shimmering kind of section that section is on poor, pathetic white people, you know, and covering up and all of it. And I think there's a reason why that section does, in fact, just go so to the heart, and there's not a wasted sentence there. One builds on another, and you are getting somewhere in an awful hurry, in exactly the way that Serene described. So what I would just want to say about that is that I suspect that one reason that section works so well the way that it does is not just the moment we're in, but that this is an enormously important subject that Kelly has been on for some time, right? It's in several of these earlier books, very strongly in What's Faith Got to Do with It, about in the middle of that book. Also, Stand Your Ground takes a run at this topic, both times with an argument about the sheer sort of resistance of white people just even recognize they have a culture. That you wouldn't think this is such a heavy lift. You might be able to get to what needs to be discussed, and that this shouldn't be a barrier, and yet you can't even get there with most people, which is what's then at stake, in this new book. It's exactly what you're talking about there. And in Stand Your Ground, you even have a section about how you can even be some kind of an anti-racist who's really very deeply, sincere and intent about this, and still just utterly resistant about the cultural question, right? And you actually talk about three kinds of it. Incidentally, in that discussion, Marxism is a stratagem all unto itself, right? There's a Marxist way of sort of avoiding this whole issue that's righteous in its own terms, and yet utterly resistant to being, I would say, shamed in order to have the right discussion. But I think because you've actually done this several times in the past, what it felt like to me is like everything that's already taken for granted in those previous books and discussions now is just being mobilized to just go straight for what moment we're in now. Yeah.
Yes, and I just, that whole section, just to echo what Gary said, is just so finely honed, and it's brilliant. Every turn of phrase and sentence, just because it's so precise and clear and right. I've now read the book through 3 times, and each time I have come back to the same image that I walk away with that stands out. I think because it builds on the core image of you and Desmond texting, this bond of family. But it's the image of you and your maternal grandmother. Called her Mama? Mamo. And her determination to see her children graduate from high school, and that hope that she wouldn't let go of. In particular, you tell the story of how at night you would crawl in bed with her, and your bodies wrapped there together, and she would tell you stories and share her hope. And it's such an embodied physical image of bond, and of where actually knowledge happens at the most profound level, at an embodied knowledge. And the two of you together, it is for me, and her passing on through her physical presence to you in that bed, wrapped up together, hope. It's an incredible image. And maybe as we move forward, you might want to say something about each of the things that we've said about those points. And I know you and I had a chance to talk about your grandmother and that.
Yeah, well, I'll start there. First, again, thank you. And it's always interesting to hear people talk about your books, because you go, right, and you go, wow, I said that? I wrote that? And I always love talking with Gary, because Gary can see the arcs that I don't see, right? And it helps, and I'm like, yeah, and he's right, because someone else can see how you're really working through things and journeying through things, and it makes it clearer to you. So to all of you, it's like, wow, okay, and it's giving me new insight. But I want to start with my maternal grandmother, who I've written about before in different places, and talk more about here, because I say, and she did, and Gary, it's what kept me to pushing on this arc for faith and believing in God's promise of a more just future, because she had such faith. And so at one point, and I say, because Desmond had asked me one day, oh, what do you think about Afro-Pessimism? Because he reads it, he explores his own questions, and so we talked about Afro-Pessimism, and it's not the Afro-Pessimists who think they're doing a new thing. It's not a new thing. I mean, theologically, William Jones wrote about this in a theological way when he asked, is God a white racist, right? And this theodicy question theologically is, when we talk about theodicy, the problem of evil in relationship to the quote-unquote justice of God, and we think of this theodicy question theologically, it is, from a black vantage point, it's the Afro-pessimist question, right? And so the Afro-pessimists say, look, let's stop all this. Maybe closer to you, Gary, ain't gonna be no just future. They're close to you. Let's stop all this. And anti-blackness is so pervasive in our world constructs that we aren't gonna get over it. And so what black people have to start doing, instead of figuring out where there's going to be a just future and how we going to get to the just future, this is my son, it's time to let's pack our bags and leave, and let's stop talking about all this mess, that you have to figure out how to navigate it and survive. And so for me, the thing that was, Serene, and I like your image and bit together, because what literally stood between me and the Afro-pessimists, me and William Jones' question coming up over and over again in new ways, was my grandmother and her faith. And it's feeling like I can't didn't want to betray her dream for her 4 grandchildren just to finish high school, because that was this much as she could dream for 4, as she would say, colored children. And I couldn't betray that dream, neither did my siblings, and I felt like I could not betray this faith that she had, so I had to keep on. She stood between me and that, right? And this thing of good white Christians, I know a lot of good white Christians, I want to like them. So I'm trying to like them. I know I gotta love them, because we're supposed to love everybody. I'm trying to like them. And if I lose some of them, if I don't like them, then some of my Rolodex gets slim. But this question was real, and again, my son pushed me on this question with one of my dear friends and my Bishop Marianne Buddy, who joined me in conversation last week on this book. And when she stood up, and she and I have written together in terms of edit commentary, have we no decency in responding to actions of the previous man that was in the White House. And so when she stood up in front of, during the Black Lives Matter protests, and when that man stood up with the upside down Bible in front of St. John's church and Episcopal Church in Washington, D.C., having violently dispersed the peaceful protesters that were there, and she stood up against him and was outraged, et cetera, et cetera. And I remember my son said, well, that's all well and good, you know, or standing up to protect the building, but where they been when, you know, Philandro and everybody else got killed protecting us? And that's the question of the good white people, right? And and I talk about one of my dear friends who's in the audience, and I'm not talking out of school because we bring it up to each other all the time. Previous dean of Washington National Cathedral, Gary Hall, and I posed this question to him in a different way with our first lunch, right, Gary, and about Trayvon Martin, and I thought Gary and I will never be friends now because I went after it, but we grew. And our friendship, as did Marianne and I. So this question of the good white Christians was again a personal question. To keep trying to figure it out, and Gary's right, I just keep trying to figure it out. It's like, what's up with these people? And it led me to a deeper understanding of the white gaze and this white way of knowing and all of that, and what it has done to our moral imaginary. And then I think Emily, Serene is making me read the last part, which I will do. But to respond to you, and you know, and Emily, you and I talk a lot as well about all of these issues, and that hope doesn't come easy. And I say this, that not only does it not come easy, it's not a once and for all thing. It's not a once and for all struggle, right? It's a constant struggle to keep hoping and to keep having faith. And as Tillich says for you, that faith and doubt are not opposites. They have to go together. And they do, and sometimes I'm living deeply in the doubt, and it seems to me to be people of color in this country, and especially to be black in America, at this time you live deeply in the doubt.
So comments from the panelists, questions, reflections, questions for Kelly? Gary, go for it.
Okay, all right, yes, indeed. Well, I've got a couple that are more theological, and these are questions you ask in virtually every book, and very much in this one too, and we'll get to things that are a little bit more theological, a little bit more toward the end of the book, so that's what I'm going for here. Firstly, the whole issue about the theology of the cross.
Yeah.
You wrote about this in your very first book, just one little paragraph, but you did speak to it. Take basically the Dolores Williams position about the cross. You're against theologies of the cross. Suffering isn't redemptive. Joanna Terrell came out with her book 4 years later, Power in the Blood, navigating this issue. You come back now between her and Cone and Williams, doubling down sort of on an argument about why you don't go for a theology of the cross, though you're recognizing it does mean something existentially that maybe isn't there in Williams, needs to be acknowledged, and that's why you always have black church communities gathering at the cross and so on. So that's sort of the narrative line going into this book. And then you do a turn in this book where you say, I realize that actually what's been sustaining me through this is a kind of solidarity of the cross, right? Argument that yes, not only do I feel it existentially, but it's the only thing even holding me in Christianity, right? Is just at that level, not theologized, no, not trying to turn it into something, not trying to sanctify it in any way, but indeed there's at least that. And then you say, but that's not enough, right? It's not enough. That as long as you were in that place, you were on the verge of having no faith at all, of just losing it. And partly because you actually don't have any of the consolations of theologies of the cross, right?
That's right.
None of that stuff is available for you. Well, all right, it's just something pretty minimal. Core, but and that's what then sets up this discussion about the losing George Floyd and the explosion that occurred, what you call the resurrection contagion, and which then mobilizes all that discussion about resurrection, hence the title. I've been going on long enough here to give you some time to think here about how you want to, how much of this you want to get into or go for. But this is a line all through your work.
That's right.
You've struggled with it in more than one way, and there is a sort of development. There's a kind of a further something that happened here in this book that isn't just what you said before. All right. So even to draw you out a little bit on that, I would love to. I've got a related question too, but
I'd love the related question, but yeah, that has been a struggle. But here's the thing, what I realized in saying the book, that I was living in the sacrificial nature of the theology of the cross.
Yeah.
And what that means, and this is something that Dolores Williams talks about, but I always think the difference between me and Dolores is that the cross is essential. But it's not the essential place for which salvation occurs. Because if you stay there in the light of George Floyd, Tamir, Breonna, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and that's terrible that you can say et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and it's a nation that lets black lives die. But what we're really, in light of that and the protests that emerged, for instance, from George Floyd's lynching, that what you were really saying is that the sacrifice of black life is necessary for us to get to this point of quote unquote racial reckoning, so-called racial reckoning. And how could that be? And so that became really real to me, and it dawned on me that's why I was stuck. Because if that theology of the cross in light of a context in which we find ourselves means that the sacrifice of black lives is necessary for salvation, and what I really wouldn't go to is necessary for white salvation. And so then how do you move from that? And so, as you know, what I don't negate the significance of the cross in terms of what it signifies about this utter solidarity, with black life, with the oppressed, et cetera, what I call the crucifying class, right, and all of what that means for God, but that cannot be the place of salvation. And for the first time, the resurrection became more significant to me than just saying I believe in the resurrection and trying to figure out whatever that means. No one knows what that means. And it became more than a confession of faith. And so I connected, and I played with this before, Gary, I guess in Stand Your Ground, to understand, and that's my response to Dolores, you gotta keep the connection between, or it's not real, but between the resurrection and the crucifixion. You have to understand that as an event, but the sacrifice isn't necessary, right? So yes. And this, of course, as you know, this was always the point of contention between James Cone and myself. Right. Was the big point of contention. And I don't know what he would say. I would ask from where I ended up now, because it became a point of contention in what's faith got to do with it.
It's true, Kelly. You are closer to him than ever right now. In how you would talk about it, what it was, even for you to be able to say, now, of course, I see it as central. His concern was always, and let's admit it, it was happening, where it just felt like it was getting dealt out of the deck. That something so fundamental in Christian doctrine was being talked about in a way as though it's just dispensable. And it always felt to Jim that that also means that just the meaning of all those black church communities gathered at the cross over all those years itself as being in some way denigrated or brushed aside. If you can say, well, theologically it means nothing to me, and it shouldn't, there's such a zig and zag about what moves you can make here to say something. But you are, in fact, with this book, I think actually very close to to that argument of crossing the lynching tree.
And I see Emily shaking her head. And shaking to say, what do you get? Emily.
It's not, do I want to get into this? Do I really want to get into this?
Kelly, I think she's waiting for you to read the afterword.
Oh, so and then we'll open it up.
Yeah, why don't we open it up to conversation after you read the afterword? And Emily, thank you for that. We had already planned on reading that at the end, so. Do you want to stand up there, or do you want to do it there?
Oh, the afterwards.
I just marked this, but let's do that.
Okay.
Yeah, and you don't have to hold the microphone if you go up there. Oh, you can do
does it matter? I could.
Can you do it with holding? Okay.
Yeah. As the summer went on and protests ended, but black deaths did not end, my son asked, "How really do you keep hoping? You lived through the 1960s and here we are again. Are you just tired of it all?" I answered by telling him about his great-great-grandmother. We called her Mama Mary. Mama Mary was born into slavery. She died when I was around 6 years old. Every time I think about Mama Mary, I think of those people who were born into slavery, died in slavery, and never drew a free breath. In fact, they never dreamt that they would ever breathe a free breath. Yet they fought for freedom anyhow. They fought for a freedom that they knew they would never see, but still believed that it would, in fact, one day be. They fought for a freedom that was nothing less than the freedom that is the justice of God. This was their hope, a hope that was found and lived out in their struggle for freedom. For it was in that struggle that they met God, even in the midst of slavery. Theirs is a resurrecting hope, because when I think of them and their fight for freedom, I cannot give in to that which would destroy black life. It is because of their hope that I am here writing this book. This is what I told my son.
So Rita's going to open it up. We're opening it up and going to share some questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Just before we do, I just want to say, first, out of the mouths of babes, right? And just thank you so much. And Desmond, thank you so much for asking the questions. I mean, you are holding all of us, your mama first, but all of us in a real way accountable to your generation. And as a mother of two black boys who are morning sunshine, afternoon tea kind of kids, I am so glad that you asked the question. And Dean Douglas, I'm not used to saying Dean Douglas, but Kelly, thank you so much for answering. Just thank you for finding the answers for all of us, especially those of us who inhabit black bodies and try our very best to protect our black girls and our black boys and our black humans? And you are starting to answer that question for us, and we are so very grateful. Thank you. Thank you. We have a wonderful, we have a huge audience online this evening, and if they were here in person, you would hear thunderous applause. But you have me to say thank you on their behalf as well. So, make sure. Our first question is from a Zoom caller. He says, and this is an easy one, so we're going to start off with a softball, right? So I have a question for the panelists. He asks, much of the theft of black life is perpetuated by police misconduct. I am for abolishing the police in New York City and in America. But what systems should replace them? If I may ask, what would a just society and world look like to you all where black life is valued absolutely? So, an easy first question.
So we should direct it to the ethicist first.
Right.
Emily Kelly just threw the question at you.
I'm having a little trouble hearing because sound is going in and out. But I think the question was, what is the alternative, or what is an alternative to policing?
Yes, that's correct. Right.
Right. I really think I don't know what's on. I don't remember what's on the side of police cars in New York anymore. But in Nashville, they have something like protect the community or something like that. But what has happened is that our police force is becoming more and more militarized. I would like to see that reversed, and instead to think more in terms of building relationships in communities that help communities protect themselves, rather than having outside gun-carrying, mace-slinging officers who are thinking more like this is a war than I'm here to protect and serve. That's a very different mindset. And so one of the things that I have wondered about is what would it look like if we changed the mindset of what policing actually looks like. We have a program here called Leadership Nashville. And we spend 9 months learning all about the city. We can't say what we saw and any of that stuff because we have confidential conversations. But one of the things I can talk about is the day in which we started the morning out in the police station. And then they took us into a room where officers train on when to use their guns. And I was struck first with, they are taught shoot to kill, not shoot to harm or to stop or to prevent or to disable, but shoot to kill. Well, when you start with that, that's what's going to happen. So I think it's the mindset that has to begin to change, that we're not here to kill people. We're here to create better communities that can protect themselves from whatever they need protection from.
Thank you. Can I quickly, and very quickly, so we get, and the interest of time, to a couple other questions, but I talk about this, in the book, and that seems to me as Emily speaks to changing the mindset, that it's not about, we have to change this whole narrative from policing and to building, to understanding that safe communities are just communities, and that we need to build just communities. And just communities are communities where people have equal opportunities and to flourish, which means that they are communities that don't foster death, but foster life. These are communities where people have the necessary housing, necessary employment, necessary health care, necessary recreational and other kind of opportunities. Poverty is a comorbidity with a number of other subsidiary things that follow from that, that is a condition under which too many Black and brown lives are trapped. It is no wonder then that we are beginning, that we see more, as they like to say, black on black crime and homicide, because actually the miracle is that you don't see more black death, that you don't see more black homicides, because we have created communities that nurture black death, not black life. And if we want to have safe communities, it's not about this kind of militarized policing, it's about building just communities, and to understand that when you have a just community, you have a safe community. And indeed, research and other kind of things tell us that. And so that's what I think when you say the alternative to policing, justice, and building communities where people can live and are meant to live.
If I could jump in quickly, one other thing you say in the book, Dean Douglas, in a chapter we haven't talked about really at all, is about resurrecting reparations. And
Yeah,
so we are in a campaign in Jersey with New Jersey Institute of Social Justice of saying the word. And so you say reparations, and then you give it theological heft with resurrections, because you don't get to a just community without the kind of repair that is necessary. And reparations is, and you do a wonderful job in the book outlining that, but without the work of reparations, you can't get to a just community because of the harm that has been done thus far.
And yes, and yes, thank you, Tim. And that reparations means not just responding to the legacy that an unjust past has created, or the culture of sin we're going to talk about theologically that we're trapped in, but we have an obligation to repair the breach between our unjust present and this more just future that we think about. And that requires more than paying people money for, that our ancestors weren't paid. It requires more than, oh, I'm sorry. It requires more than that. It requires a dismantling of these very systems and structures that have created this situation in the first place. Otherwise, the next generation is still going to be talking about reparations. So we've got to change. So the repair has to be between this unjust present and this more just future that we claim that we want to live into. So you're right. Yeah.
I'm right because you're right.
I'll take that.
I will say, as a mother, there are 5 words that you never want to hear from your black sons or daughters or humans, or you just do not want to hear it from a loved one. And I've heard those words from my son, been stopped by the police. Now, the only sort of saving grace of that is I heard the words from him, right? That he lived to tell the story. But if you want to really get unhoused, have the phone ring at midnight and hear your son who's on his way to college, who has just gotten back from a trip and driving the 2 hours it takes from my house to his school, that within an hour, say, I've been stopped by the police. So when your son says, I can't think of a reason to call the police, that's not an abstract intellectual exercise. That is a real cry to say that I don't understand the role of people who do the business of the state, right? In a structural system that's racism. Now, I'm not a scholar, but I think I'm one where I have a podium, so I'm going to move on. Right? That's right. So the next question is, I'm here with undergraduate, so this is a student from Iona College who says, I'm here with undergraduate students from my class at Iona College on creative peacemaking. And we've been exploring how Gen Z are socially engaged in the Black Lives Matter movement, but not from a traditional faith commitment in a way that you have, or I would perhaps understand that commitment. What would you say to those young people who may not believe in God of a more just future as your motivating force for being a part of building that future? An excellent, excellent question.
So what would I'm trying to...
Yeah, I'll say it again. I'll just say that last part again. So this student is saying that we may not believe in God. Right? So how do we still want to be part of that future and do this work? What do you say to us?
You don't have to believe in God, you have to believe in a vision that there's justice is possible, right? And so it's not, I mean, I come at it from, most times, from a faith perspective, but I think, and I talk about this, just expanding the moral imaginary of what is possible. And what I get from Gen Z, is that from those out there protesting, and I don't ask them, do you believe in God? Do you believe in Jesus? That's not important. What I want to know, and they've already said that because they're out there risking their lives in the middle of a pandemic to fight for justice, that they believe that something more is possible. That's all you got to believe in, and you fight for it. I don't care what gets you there. Just be on that arc, and I'm learning from you, right? So I have a different sort of thing that's pushing me to that transcendent vision that there's more possible than this. And so that to me is what's essential. And I should say to the person who asked the question, and to those out there who are in the protests and don't believe, let me tell you, it is you that keep me believing. And I say that in the book.
Professor Jones?
Oh, I'll just say, I might even answer a bit more selfishly. Do you want to live? Yeah. Right? That the vision for a just future is not only for those that will come, but I mean, they're very real, tangible benefits. I mean, I know that stress of being pulled over, and I know that stress now of being pulled over with my children in the car. And so it's not only about them, obviously their future, but I mean, simply, do I want to see another day? So if you want to see another day, then you have to fight for another day. And I think even selfish motivations become something that keep those, even without a kind of larger theological vision for why we do this work in the first place.
President Jones referred to you as a prophetic theologian. In that prophetic vein, what do you think theologians in 20 years will be writing about in relations to the value of Black lives? So you ain't never going to retire.
I will have to be living a long time to be writing in 20 years, but I hope. But Gary, right, I'm looking at Gary, I don't know. I hope that we'll be a little further along to creating a world where Black lives matter. I hope at least we get to the point, because we aren't there now, where, you know, people, we say Black lives matter and someone says, no, all lives matter. And what that means is you can't even allow Black life, a Black body, to symbolize humanity. You can't even see to say Black lives matter, you can't even see that as a representative of what it means for all life to matter. You can't even so I hope at least we're at the point that people can see the sacredness of the Black body, and that it can represent humanity, because right now we can't. So I just hope we're a little further along, and I don't know. I know Tim, I'm looking at Tim shaking his head. I don't know. You the preacher, what are you going to be preaching about in 20 more years? Right. You'll still be around. That's what I mean. You see, I skipped over you, Serene, and you, Gary, and you, Emily, all my peers. So I'm looking at Brother Tim. What are you going to be preaching about?
I don't know, one might say if I'm preaching in 20 years, maybe I've done something wrong. But I think that what I'd like to see is further nuance about the ways that attained privilege, even amongst oppressed groups, functions and operates to continue to perpetuate oppression. So I think if I would hope that, because I'm trying to hold on to a vision of a just future, I am. But if not, at the very least, let the conversation have progressed to the point where we can nuance the ways that we talk about oppression in particular, and recognize, at least amongst some, a certain kind of ascertaining of power, and how that ascertaining of power just goes back to, for some, there's the has, for some, there's some accomplishments, for some have reached different places of life, but yet there's a sort of underclass, if you will, that just continues to get pushed further down. So I hope that even if we've not yet gotten to that place, that we can be more nuanced in the ways that we talk about it.
One more question?
Yeah, of course. Just want to redress myself on one. So the question that I thought was from a student, it was actually from the faculty member, Dr. Teresa Delgado, who asked that question. So I want to make that right. So,
Union grad.
Right, exactly. Oh, yeah, right. Who's
Hi,
a union
Teresa.
grad. So I hope you would charge that to my head and not to my heart. So the last question, just a fan shout out, just want to get that in. Dr. Towns, there's another caller on from Franklin, Tennessee, and he says, we're so excited to have Dr. Dean Towns with us tonight. So big shout out there. We had a lot of questions that came in, and I'm sorry we can't get to them all in the interest of time. But what we'll do is actually save these questions. And now that Dean Douglas will have more than 2 hours on Christmas, maybe we can send the list of questions at some point, and we can figure out how to get those posted or out.
Rita, maybe you could read like 4 of them.
Right, I'll try to do, right. So that's a great idea. So here's one. Thank you for this book and event. Can the very Reverend KBD say a bit more about how resurrection functions in the book, one? If there is time, how do we reconcile ideas of resurrection in the face of Dr. Gary Dorian's beautiful comment on belief of God's promise of a just future? And if I could just get to another. What is your call to action for readers of this book? Wonderful, wonderful question. What do you wish Christians would start doing after reading the book? And then the last question, if you all can just hold all of these ideas in your head. What does the church look like in the future where Black Lives Matter? I think we've sort of answered that one a bit, but do you want to start with the third to the last question? What is your call for action for the readers of this book? And what do you wish Christians would start doing after reading it?
I think, just to be brief, and when you read it, so they said after reading the book, so in the reading of the book, there are a number of calls to action. Actually, and particularly in the chapter on reparations, et cetera, et cetera. But in general, the call to action is action, is to get engaged in justice making. And proximity, and being proximate, thank you, to being proximate, finding a way to be proximate to those crucified classes of people, because that's where justice begins. When they say, this looks like justice, and we know we're least in that direction, not when privileged people say that. The thing with resurrection, then is that in practical response, how do we know the resurrection? The resurrection contagion was all those Black Lives Matter protests erupting all over the world. That's resurrection.
And then, do you want to just try to tackle really quickly, how do you reconcile the ideas of resurrection in the face of Dr. Gary's beautiful comment on belief of God's promise of a just future.
Well, see, I should leave that with Gary because I believe in it. Because I do, and the task is to find those moments where you see a glimpse. I don't think that it's going to happen in 20 years, but and maybe when whatever happens when this life is over, I always do say, I keep myself aware of the fact that, you know, in that language of the black church, so when I get to the other side and see God face to face, God will say, "Fool, what made you think that I was on the side of the oppressed and that I was a liberator? Didn't you see they was killing y'all? There was this, that. What made you even think that?" So I hold out for God saying, "No," but I live, so I mean, you know, there's the doubt, but I live. The fact, I will end with this and Gary can end. The fact that my great grandmother, whom I knew, was born into slavery. The fact that my grandmother didn't have the possibility of an education beyond the 6th grade. And in all the time that I knew her, ran an elevator, and that the only dream that she could possibly muster for her grandchildren was that they would finish high school. And I am sitting here right now talking about a book I've written as a dean of a divinity school. That is how I reconcile the injustice we're living in now with the belief in a more just future, because I'm here from people who were enslaved and couldn't even dream that I could ever sit in a position like this. And so that's why.
Feels like the last Bravo, bravo. And those of us who are filling this room know and love you, and we are so very, very proud of you. We cannot wait until the next book. So take Christmas off. We got you. But there is another day.
Thank you.
Right? And there's still much work to be done. But there are many who think as you do. So we look forward to the next work. Right. Thank you. And President Jones, if you want to have the last word for us. There's a reception, so please don't run out of here. We have food. And there's a glass of wine. We hope that you would enjoy that as part of this evening before it comes to a close as well. Right.
No, I just want to say amen and resurrection hope. So, amen, and enjoy the evening.
Thank you.